The city was restless in the years after the war. People wanted to forget the rubble, the hunger, the silence of the streets where entire families had once lived. By the early 1960s, life seemed to be moving forward. Neon lights glowing, newspapers boasting of progress, theaters reopening with laughter echoing inside. But beneath that mask of normality, shadows lingered. Thomas Hale, a 26-year-old journalist for the Evening Chronicle, had always been drawn to those shadows. He wanted more than stories of ribbon cuttings and cultural festivals. He wanted truth. And when whispers began circulating about bodies disappearing from cemeteries and morgues across the city, Thomas felt a chill settle deep in his bones. It began innocently enough. A gravedigger from the East End came into the newsroom one night, drunk and pale, insisting that the coffin he had buried the week before had been dug up, the body gone. No valuables stolen. No damage to the casket. Just empty. The editor laughed, waved him away, and told Thomas to stick to covering the mayor's upcoming speech. But the man's hollow eyes haunted him. A few days later, a young woman approached Thomas at the cafe where he often lingered with his notebook. She introduced herself only as Marianne, her voice trembling as she told him her brother had vanished. He hadn't been seen since he left his night shift at the hospital morgue. His wallet and coat were found in a back alley, but his body had never turned up. Thomas began to notice a pattern. Families whispered about funerals where caskets felt lighter than they should. Nurses admitted, off the record, that some corpses delivered to the anatomy schools never matched the paperwork. No one wanted to talk openly. Fear clung to them like a second skin. Late one night, Thomas wandered into the district near the river docks. The fog rolled thick from the water, muffling every sound. He spotted a cart, covered in tarpaulin, rolling down a side street. The men pulling it avoided the main road, their faces hidden beneath caps. When the cart hit a bump, the corner of the cover lifted, just for a moment, and Thomas saw a pale arm dangling, fingers curled, nails dirty. He froze. For a second he thought he might be hallucinating. But then the men disappeared into a warehouse with their load, and the door slammed shut. That night Thomas could not sleep. He scrawled in his notebook, his hands shaking. Bodies are being taken. But where? And why? The next morning, when he tried to question the warehouse workers, he was met with hostility. One man leaned close enough that Thomas could smell tobacco and something rotten on his breath. "Drop this story," the man hissed, "or you'll end up just like them." But Thomas couldn't let it go. His curiosity was stronger than fear. He had stumbled onto something vast, something festering beneath the city's surface. Something that connected the cemeteries, the hospitals, and perhaps even the people in power. That evening, as he walked home, he felt someone following him. Footsteps, steady and deliberate, echoing against the cobblestones. He turned quickly, but the street was empty. Only shadows. Yet he knew, with a certainty that hollowed his chest, that he was no longer just investigating a story. He had stepped into the path of something unspeakable. Thomas tried to convince himself that the footsteps had been a trick of his imagination. But the next morning, when he opened the door to collect the newspaper, he found something on the stoop. A scrap of cloth, torn and dirty, with what looked like dried blood staining the edges. Folded inside was a note, written in jagged letters. "The dead should rest. Leave them be." His hands trembled as he shoved the note into his pocket before any neighbors could see. For a long moment he stood in the doorway, staring at the empty street. The silence felt heavier now, charged with unseen eyes. At the Chronicle, his editor scoffed when Thomas showed him the note. "Pranks, that's all. You've got an overactive imagination, Hale. Write about the mayor, write about the schools. Leave the graveyard stories to the penny magazines." But Thomas couldn't. The night at the docks still clung to him, the image of that pale arm burned into his memory. Against his editor's orders, he started visiting the families of the missing. One old woman, Mrs. Whitlow, led him into her parlor where the curtains were drawn tight even though it was midday. She spoke in a whisper, as though afraid the walls themselves might overhear. "They took my husband," she said. "He died last winter. Buried proper. But when I went to place flowers, the earth was disturbed. The coffin was empty. Do you understand? Empty. And the police, they laughed at me. Said I must be mistaken." Her thin hands clutched Thomas's wrist with surprising strength. "It's not just thieves. They don't want trinkets. They want the bodies. Whole." Thomas left shaken. The more he asked, the more stories came. Coffins without corpses, hospital deaths with no trace of remains, families warned to stop asking questions. Each account was fragmented, whispered, but together they formed a pattern too clear to ignore. One evening Marianne returned. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her voice cracked. "I found something," she whispered, handing Thomas a folded piece of paper. It was a list, names, dates, ages. Most were marked with a red cross. Many of the names were already familiar to Thomas from his interviews. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "My brother kept notes about the morgue," she said. "He told me once that some of the bodies were collected. Not for study. For something else. I found this hidden in his room after he disappeared." The list was long. Too long. That night, Thomas couldn't keep himself away from the docks. He waited in the fog, hidden in an alley across from the warehouse he had seen before. Hours passed. Then just past midnight a cart arrived. This time there was no attempt at concealment. The men dragged something out, a body, slack and pale, wrapped in coarse cloth. Thomas's stomach lurched, but he forced himself to stay hidden, scribbling frantic notes. The men unlocked a side door. As they dragged the body inside, a sickly yellow light spilled out for a moment, revealing not crates or barrels but rows of tables. For an instant, Thomas swore he saw a body laid out, chest split open, something glistening under the lamps. Then the door slammed shut. His pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to run, to leave this nightmare behind. But his curiosity, his hunger for the truth, was stronger. Thomas decided he had to get inside that warehouse. What he didn't know was that someone, somewhere in the fog, was already watching him. The following night, Thomas prepared himself. He dressed in dark clothes, packed a small camera, and tucked his notebook into his coat pocket. The warehouse on the docks had become an obsession. Every instinct screamed that crossing its threshold was a mistake, but his curiosity gnawed at him like a hunger. He waited until the fog crept in, thick and heavy, cloaking the streets. The sound of a ship horn in the distance gave him cover as he slipped from shadow to shadow. When he reached the warehouse, he crouched low by the side wall. The bricks were damp, smelling of salt and mold. The back door was secured with a heavy lock, but Thomas noticed a narrow window above, its glass cracked. With a grunt, he hauled himself up and squeezed through. His coat snagged, tearing at the seam, but he pushed forward until he dropped onto a cold cement floor. For a moment, he crouched in silence, his breath loud in the cavernous dark. Then he pulled out his small flashlight and flicked it on. The beam revealed tables, rows of them. On each table lay a body, shrouded in cloth or partially uncovered. Thomas's throat tightened. Some of the corpses were split open, their chests caved, their insides missing. Others were eerily untouched, their faces pale, lips slack, as though they might wake at any moment. He stepped closer, the echo of his shoes magnified in the silence. A pungent, metallic stench filled the air, mingled with something acrid that burned his nose. He lifted the cloth from one body and his heart nearly stopped. The man's eyes were sewn shut with coarse thread. His mouth too stitched closed. Yet across his chest, fresh incisions gleamed wet. Whoever had been working on him hadn't finished. Thomas turned, while rising in his throat. On a desk nearby, he found a ledger, its pages filled with neat, methodical handwriting. Names, dates, organs listed beside each entry. But there were also symbols, strange markings, circles with slashes, lines that seemed more ritual than medical. A sudden sound froze him. Footsteps. He darted into the shadows, crouching behind a stack of crates. The side door creaked open, spilling in yellow light. 2 men entered, dragging another body. This one wasn't pale like the others. The skin still held color, the limbs limp with the weight of recent death. "We're falling behind schedule," one muttered. His voice was rough, impatient. "The professor wants at least 3 more before Sunday." The other grunted. "He'll get what he wants. He always does." Thomas's stomach knotted. The body wasn't stolen from a grave. It was fresh. Someone had been killed recently. The men heaved the corpse onto a table, pulling back the cloth to reveal a young man's face. His eyes were still open, staring upward with a frozen expression of terror. Thomas bit his fist to keep from making a sound. Then, from deeper inside the warehouse, another voice called. Calm, cold, precise. "Bring it here. We've wasted enough time." The 2 men obeyed, wheeling the table toward a partition at the far end. As they passed, Thomas caught a glimpse of the figure waiting beyond. A tall man in a dark coat, his hair silver under the lamplight. His gloved hands adjusted instruments laid neatly on a tray. The professor. Thomas dared not move. But his trembling hand reached for his notebook. He began to scrawl blindly in the dark. "They are not grave robbers. They are hunters. And someone is orchestrating it all." A loud clang echoed. One of the men paused, sniffing the air, then looked toward the crates where Thomas hid. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Thomas held his breath, praying the darkness would conceal him. But the professor lifted his head, his sharp eyes scanning the warehouse. "We are not alone," he said softly. And with those words, Thomas knew he had just crossed a line he could never retreat from. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. The professor's words hung in the air like a death sentence. "We are not alone." The two men froze. One of them dropped the scalpel he had been holding, the clatter echoing in the hollow space. Then slowly they turned their heads toward the crates. Thomas dared not breathe, pressing himself deeper into the shadows. His fingers gripped his notebook so tightly the spine bent. "Check," the professor commanded, his voice steady, calm, as though he had all the time in the world. One of the men obeyed, heavy boots crunching across the floor. He moved with the deliberate patience of a predator. Each step was measured, savoring the fear he knew lingered nearby. Thomas's mind raced. The window he had crawled through was too far, too high. The front door was blocked by the professor and the other man. There was only one chance, waiting, timing, and luck. The man drew closer. The stink of sweat and something rancid filled Thomas's nostrils. He crouched lower, his body shaking with tension. Then, just as the man's hand brushed the edge of the crate, a sound broke through the silence. A low groan. Everyone froze. It had come from the table. From the body they had just laid down. Thomas's stomach lurched. He saw the young man's fingers twitch, his chest quiver with a shallow, ragged breath. He wasn't dead. Not yet. The professor stepped forward quickly, irritated. "You fools," he snapped. "I told you, alive is no good unless he's fully restrained. Hold him down." The two men rushed back, pinning the struggling figure. The young man's muffled cries filled the warehouse as he writhed beneath their hands. The professor calmly selected a syringe from the tray, his movements precise, unhurried. Thomas watched in horror as the needle sank into the victim's neck. Within seconds the thrashing slowed. The young man's eyes rolled back, lids fluttering shut. "Now," the professor said softly, "we begin." He picked up a saw, its teeth glinting under the light. Thomas's body screamed at him to run, but his mind, damned with obsession, forced him to stay. He fumbled his camera from his coat, raising it just enough to snap a photo. The faint click echoed louder than a gunshot in his ears. The professor's head turned instantly. His cold eyes narrowed, searching the shadows. "There," he whispered. The two men dropped the victim and charged. Thomas bolted, his legs moving before his brain caught up. He darted through rows of tables, bumping into cold bodies, knocking over trays that clattered to the ground. His flashlight slipped from his hand, rolling away. The darkness swallowed him, save for the thin moonlight bleeding through cracks in the walls. He saw a narrow staircase at the far corner and sprinted toward it. The steps groaned beneath his weight as he scrambled up. Behind him, boots pounded, voices barked. "He's here. Don't let him out." At the top of the stairs he found a door, rusted, half-rotten. He shoved it with his shoulder. The wood gave way with a splintering crack, and he stumbled into a narrow loft that overlooked the warehouse floor. Below, the professor stood calmly amid the chaos. He raised a gloved hand, signaling the men to stop. "Let him run," the professor said, his voice carrying easily. "He will return. They always do." Thomas froze. The man's eyes, sharp as knives, looked directly up at him as though he could pierce the dark. A faint smile curled across the professor's lips. Terrified, Thomas turned and fled through the loft's broken window, tumbling onto the roof of the adjoining building. He rolled, scraped, and staggered to his feet before sprinting into the night. But even as he escaped, his mind echoed with the professor's words. They always return. And Thomas knew deep down the man was right. Something had been planted in him that night, an infection of terror and curiosity that would not let go. He could flee as far as he wanted, but the warehouse, the bodies, the professor's cold smile, they would haunt him. And sooner or later he would be pulled back. The days that followed were not days at all for Thomas, but a blur of nightmarish fragments. He couldn't sleep without seeing the warehouse in his dreams, the bodies lined up like discarded dolls, the young man's muffled cry, the professor's eyes drilling into his skull. He'd wake drenched in sweat, convinced someone stood at the foot of his bed, watching. He tried to tell himself he was safe. He had escaped. The professor couldn't possibly know who he was or where he lived. And yet, every time Thomas stepped outside, he felt eyes on him. A man in a dark coat seemed to linger near the corner cafe 2 days in a row. A van idled too long across from his apartment. Once, he came home to find his front door unlocked. though he was certain he had bolted it that morning. His editor at the newspaper noticed the change. "You look like hell," she muttered, studying his trembling hands as he tried to type. "You need rest. Take time off." But rest was impossible. The photos he had taken, blurry, dark but unmistakable, burned in his pocket. He couldn't show them to anyone. Who would believe him? A shadowy warehouse, half-lit bodies, faceless men. It looked like something out of a fever dream. Yet Thomas knew what he had seen was real. One evening, unable to endure the paranoia, he poured a glass of whiskey and stared at the photos spread across his desk. The professor's silhouette loomed in one shot, his gloved hand raised mid-command. In another, the young man's pale hand stretched toward the lens, a final silent plea. Thomas whispered to the images, "I can't ignore this. I can't." That night he resolved to go back. Not for curiosity, not for obsession, but to gather undeniable proof. Proof strong enough to expose the horrors beneath the city. Armed with his camera, a flashlight, and a revolver borrowed from an old friend, Thomas returned to the warehouse under cover of darkness. His heart hammered as he approached the sagging structure. The night air was heavy, still, as if even the insects dared not intrude. The window he had used before was sealed with new boards. The door was padlocked with a heavy chain. But one of the side walls, half collapsed, offered a gap wide enough to squeeze through. He slid inside, the smell of rot immediately overwhelming him. The warehouse was silent. The tables were empty. The crates had been cleared. It was as though nothing had ever happened. His stomach turned cold. Had they moved? Had they known he would come back? He moved carefully through the shadows, snapping photos of the barren interior, the stains on the floor, the chains bolted to the wall. His flashlight beam caught something glinting near one of the tables. A locket. He picked it up, his hands trembling. Inside was a photograph of a girl, maybe 12 years old, smiling with innocence. His breath caught. He remembered the missing persons reports, the posters plastered around town. This girl had been one of them. Thomas pocketed the locket, while rising in his throat. Proof. At least some proof. He turned to leave but froze. A sound echoed through the cavernous space. A slow, deliberate clap. Thomas swung his flashlight toward the source. The professor stood in the doorway, perfectly calm, hands folded behind his back. His men flanked him like shadows. "You came back," the professor said softly, a smile playing at his lips. "I told you you would." Thomas raised the revolver, his hand shaking violently. "Stay back," he croaked. But the professor did not move. His eyes gleamed, cold and certain. "You think you're the first? The first to stumble onto our work? The first to believe you can expose us? No. They all come back, driven by the same sickness you feel now. And they all stay." The men began to advance, silent and steady. Thomas fired. The shot thundered through the warehouse, the recoil jarring his arm. One of the men staggered, clutching his shoulder. But the others didn't flinch. He turned and ran. The professor's voice followed him, calm and unhurried, echoing in the dark. "You cannot run from what you've seen. You belong to us now." Thomas burst through the side wall, stumbling into the night. He sprinted down the street, lungs burning, legs barely carrying him. He didn't stop until he collapsed against the door of his apartment building, gasping, trembling, clutching the locket like a lifeline. But even as he staggered upstairs and locked himself inside, a sickening truth gnawed at him. The professor hadn't tried to stop him. He had let him go. And that meant only one thing. It wasn't escape. It was a trap. For 3 days, Thomas didn't leave his apartment. He pushed furniture against the door, covered the windows, and sat with the revolver on his lap. He barely ate. The only thing that kept him from unraveling completely was the locket. He would open it, stare at the smiling girl's face, and remind himself that what he saw was real, that he hadn't gone mad. But the longer he waited, the more he realized the professor was right. He wasn't free. He was being allowed to wait. And waiting was worse than any chase. On the 4th night, his phone rang. The old rotary phone he never used, the one connected only to the landline. He froze. He hadn't given that number to anyone. Slowly he picked up the receiver. "Thomas," came the professor's voice, smooth and unhurried. "I hope you've been resting." Thomas's breath caught. He tried to speak, but his throat closed. "You've been chosen," the professor continued. "You see what others cannot. You understand what must be done. We've watched you. We know your hunger. You can't fight it forever." "I'm not like you," Thomas rasped, clutching the revolver. A soft chuckle. "You already are. Otherwise you wouldn't have returned. Otherwise you wouldn't still be alive." The line went dead. Thomas dropped the phone, his heart hammering. He staggered to the bathroom, splashing water on his face, staring into the mirror. But the reflection staring back didn't feel like his anymore. His eyes looked darker, hollow, feverish. That night, he dreamed of the warehouse, not empty this time but alive with voices. The professor stood at the center, and around him were rows of tables, each bearing a body. Thomas stood among the men, his hands bloodied, his stomach full. He woke gagging while burning his throat. But deep inside, beneath the horror, a flicker of something else churned. Something he refused to name. Days bled into weeks. He tried to write his story, to put it all down, but every word felt hollow. No paper could capture the truth. No one would believe him. And yet, the locket burned in his pocket like a brand. One evening, desperate for air, he walked into the city. The streets were crowded, neon signs buzzing, music spilling from bars. He tried to lose himself in the noise, to pretend life was normal. But then he saw him. The professor. Standing across the street watching. Beside him, the girl from the locket. Alive. Smiling. Holding his hand. Thomas froze, his mind shattering. She wasn't dead. Or maybe she was. Maybe none of it mattered. The professor lifted a hand in a gentle wave, and for the briefest moment, Thomas felt the world tilt, like everything he'd known was a lie, and the truth was far darker than he could ever comprehend. He ran. He didn't know where, only that he had to keep moving. He ran through alleys, across streets, until the city blurred. But no matter how fast he went, he could feel them behind him, patient, unhurried, always watching. The last thing Thomas remembered was collapsing against a wall, the locket slipping from his pocket, clattering to the ground. When morning came, the alley was empty. The locket lay in a small puddle, its photograph smeared and unrecognizable. Thomas was never seen again. Some say he vanished, consumed by madness. Others whisper he joined them, that the professor had claimed another soul. But late at night, when the streets are quiet and shadows stretch long, a man can be seen lingering near the old warehouse. His eyes are hollow, his clothes stained, and his mouth curls into a faint, hungry smile. And if you get too close, he'll tell you his name. Thomas.